Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Bigfoot Tales. I'm your host Dan, the Bigfoot Man, coming to you from the glorious coastline of the state of Maine. Beautiful day out there today. Hope when you're listening to this you're having as nice a day. But today we're going to go back to the turn of the century, and that is the turning of the 19th into the 20th century, or right around the period of 1900. And we're going to go to Butte, Montana. This is an interesting story. Just as a quick background, and as to why I'm sharing this one, and where the direction that I'm going to in this part. It's actually a two-part. I'm going to read part of a book and part of a newspaper article that'll explain the whole thing. And basically, the book is an autobiography of a James Wardner. It was published in 1900. And the town of Wardner, Idaho, is named after him. He was actually an early promoter of some huge silver mines, namely the Bunker Hill and Sullivan mine in the 1880s. And he was a real estate hypester. He sold a lot of corner lots in the city. But he was known for telling some stories, and he died in 1905, so some of this autobiography is kind of questionable, but just as a quick mention here, there's a lot of hoaxes in the Bigfoot community. One of the things that makes a hoax more believable to many people is the grain of truth that exists in all lies. The bigger the grain of truth, the easier it is to perpetuate a hoax over somebody. And this particular one is a chapter 7 of his book. It's called The Wildman of Montana. And in this, he describes what could be considered to be, by many of us today, a human-like Bigfoot. But when I get into the actual story, you'll understand why this is considered to be, by some, to be a Bigfoot. And I have actually in the past read some glitches, or not rather glitches, but glimpses of stories that some people have tried to share. The suggestion that this was actually a true Bigfoot story, but I want to set the story straight here. I'm into folklore. Folklore is mostly about making stories easy to understand. Much of what a lot of people consider to be history is not true history, but folklore history. In that stories are changed and names are changed to protect the innocent, sort of deal. But we'll get into the story first, and then I'll get into the newspaper article that supports the story and at the same time refutes the story. And again, this is an autobiography of James Wardner. And this is Chapter 7, The Wildman of Montana. It was some years after this when, in an interval of quietude, I heard the capture of a wild man of the woods near Butte, Montana. The reports had the ring of veracity, and I determined to investigate. Arriving in Butte in November, I immediately drove out to the Big Hole country, the scene of the capture. Here, in the barn of his captor, I found a semi-human being that could talk, seemingly of a kind disposition, who could not account for his condition. He was extremely uneasy, under restraint, but apparently harmless. And here we go with the description of why some people seem to think it's a Bigfoot creature. This creature was short, well-built, and his body was covered with hair the length and shade of a black bear's. The hair of his head was in clusters and mats as big as your hand, lying plastered on his head and dangling on his neck. His sole raiment was an old pair of pants cut off at the knees. These had been furnished him by Mr. Greal, his captor. I forgot to say that he had eyebrows fully 4 inches long, sticking nearly straight out, behind which glistened as bright a pair of round, quick, glittering brown eyes as were ever seen in ape or chimpanzee. Mr. Greal listened favorably to my proposition. The freak consented, and we bundled him into a wagon. I driving, and Greal and Beefsteak Bill managing the menagerie end of the business. Our troubles, however, commenced here. Our horses were without binders on their bridles, and when they sniffed the stronger, bare smell of our captive, they fiercely tore through the sagebrush, finally becoming unmanageable. Both Greal and Beefsteak Bill came at once to my rescue. Just then, a scared rabbit darted across the road. Mr. Bearman was out of the wagon in a second and ran for dear life. The rabbit squealed and bounded on, but the Bearman was too swift for him. For a half a mile away, I saw the finish. The horses were soon cooled down, and Greal, mounting one, went in pursuit of our treasure, who awaited his coming. When Greal came up to him, his mouth was still bloody from the eaten rabbit, of which nothing remained except here and there some bits of skull and bones and fur. Greal and Bill walked with him to Butte, but far in the rear of the horses. All went well until a bicycle was met, when his excitement knew no bounds. Pulling away, he chased it briskly, but the rider, scared to death and with a good long start, eluded him. We came near losing him, and would have done so had not a cowboy accurately thrown a lasso and checked him. Pulling a blanket around him, he was marched to Greal's shack, just outside Butte, and I, as a manager, started out to hire a hall. After having a gorgeous banner and pictures painted in glowing colors, illustrating his wondrous exploit, I hired Caprice Hall and advertised to exhibit him at 50 cents admission. Great crowds came to see him, and we one day added a gramophone to our show. That settled it. He disappeared and was found 2 days afterwards in a prospect hole with 2 ribs broken. Dr. Norcross took charge of him, but so hard did he plead to return to where the green grass grew, and the cold water ran, and fresh rabbits were plentiful, and where no devil's trumpet crazed him, that I consented, and Greal and I took him back to Big Hole. He had really ceased to be a notoriety, but not before Greal and I were much ahead in the venture. As the ghost never walked in on our show, our expenses were a minimum. That's the end of the story part. We'll get into real briefly, the description of them. The height of the creature is not what we consider a Bigfoot today. It was short, but some people would have, and I have seen some people refer to this as a younger Bigfoot, not fully grown. And here we get into one of the questions of exactly how big is a Bigfoot. And that I'm not really going to address in this venue here. But I do have some serious problems accepting some of these claims that they've seen, 14, 15, 16 foot tall Bigfoots and bigger. I really have a hard time believing that. But anyhow, this creature was short, well built, and his body was covered with a hair the length and shade of a black bear's. The hair of his head was in clusters of mats as big as your hand, lying plastered on his head and dangling on his neck. Of course, he was wearing pants, but the pants were not his when they first captured him. He was naked. The pants were given to him by Mr. Greal. And also in the description, he had eyebrows fully 4 inches long, sticking nearly straight out, behind which glistened a pair of brown, quick, glittering brown eyes, as were ever seen in ape or chimpanzee. Here, we have a body, human body, covered with hair, the length and shade of a black bear's, which would give him a furry coat, rather stupendously hairy man. And we look at his hair in clusters and mats as big as your hand, laying plastered on his head and dangling on his neck. That would give a person the image from behind of having a cone-like head with no neck. And also the eyebrows 4 inches long, sticking nearly straight out, would certainly give him the image of having a brow ridge, which many people have claimed they've seen on these Bigfoot creatures. And brown eyes. So, briefly or quickly looking at this stories, the description sort of matches what you would consider to be a Bigfoot. However, our story goes a little bit further than that, and we have some problems where we get into much of the stories that are floating around Bigfoot today. A lot of people, when they latch on to things, they don't actually go into the real in-depth research beyond the hype, the headline, the immediate emergency or urgency of the story, to find out whether it was true or not. But on the other hand, I do. Frequently, I have found that some of these Wildman stories were actually turned out to be not quite so wild. For instance, the Winstead Wildman of Connecticut. A lot of people have claimed it was a Bigfoot story, but in the end, I've actually found the actual article, and I'm going to get into this in another a video when I revisit the Connecticut Wildman. He actually turned out to be a individual who had gone demented after the love of his life rejected him. He actually had proposed to a woman, and she just said she didn't want to have anything to do with him. Apparently, she was just leading him on for his money and his fame and fortune, or whatever he had at the time. We'll get into that when I do that video. But it turned out he was just a overly hairy man who had just gone demented. And this is where a lot of these wildmen that we see in the woods today are. They're just normal human beings that look a little different and think a little different than, the mainstream of society. So, but whenever you see one of these stories, you have to, like I said, do the research into the backstory and try to find some legitimate supporting documents for these stories to find out if it's true or if it's just a total fabrication. Of course, in Mr. Wardner's case, the part involving him is kind of questionable. Number one, he died in 1905. He wrote his book in 1900. And the book suggests that he had actually done this quite a while before he had entered his latter years. So, let's get into the actual story here, end article. I did actually come into some supporting documentation in a newspaper called the Roundup Review. It's from the Record Tribune and Winnet Times from out of Montana. It's dated July 11th, 1940, and it was written by an Enid Davis. And in this article, the writer is actually had done the research to find out whether there actually was a real wild man. But we'll get into the story, or excuse me, the newspaper article. And as recalled by D.C. Flint, Thompson Falls, Butte had its own wild man in the 90s. He was discovered by Fred Whitford and Al Greel in the Wise River country, 150 miles southwest of Butte. They persuaded him to accompany them on their return, May 21st, 1895. He told them that he had lived alone in that region for 29 years, having come there from Wisconsin, his home, after the Civil War, in which he served. The reason for coming, he said, was to avoid the decaying civilization of the time. He had been quite happy in the wilds, living in a rough lean-to among some rocks, eating uncooked flesh of animals and making his clothing from their skins. In fact, it was reported that he jumped from the wagon on the trip in and, catching a jackrabbit, devoured it at once. This, in spite of the fact that he was 68 years of age and not so spry as he once was. He had had a few visitors, the most persistent being an anaconda for Capital Boomer who was looking for boats. The wild man told Whitford and Greel he had been at Butte when he first came to the country, but had never been nearer than 12 miles after that. He was afraid of the newfangled electric lights and would not come nearer than Whitford's roadhouse on the first evening. He did accept some city clothes, shoes, a coat, and overalls. His fame spread rapidly, and he was finally prevailed upon to allow himself to be exhibited at Caplice Hall, 25 South Main. Tickets, 25 cents. But after 10 days of this quiet life, the man of the wilds became restive, escaped, and wandered into the central firehouse. The firemen were delighted to have such a distinguished visitor. They sounded a special alarm. The big front doors opened. The horses were released, dashed into their places, and were hitched up in double-quick time. The wild man was much impressed, and is quoted as saying, "Darned if that don't beat the coyotes." But he did not ask for another demonstration. Instead, he wandered out and settled himself for a setting on the south side of the California brewery. He was brewing, perhaps, on the manifestations of decadent society. That's the end of that article, and you see that, wherever you have a hoax, there's actually a grain of truth in it. And the more realistic or the more true the truth is, the easier it is to pass a hoax off as being a legitimate whatever it is. But so we go back into the story by Mr. Wardner, and one of the things that I have to mention about Mr. Wardner is that he is also known as being quite a storyteller, and one of the stories that he has told is that he's actually the progenitor of a hoax, or actually not necessarily a hoax, but a joke. Probably a little bit more realistic, where he is known, and I've still heard mentions of this today, about his cat ranch. He jokingly stated that he was going to invest in a black cat ranch because black cats were popular. They were used for the making of mink stoles, or faux mink stoles, and faux mink hand muffs. It could actually bring a good price. His idea was that he was going to be able to raise black cats on an island. He was not going to allow any dogs on there, but it was supposed to be a real hot investment. Of course, he did this just as a joke because he was a jokester and he liked telling tall tales. But the truth is that he has a history, or rather had a history, of being quite successful in anything that he delved into. He died a multimillionaire, and after all, a town was named after him. Some of the biggest silver mines of the West, and gold mines of Africa and the Klondike and several other areas have his name attached to it, or his influence attached to them in history. So he actually had people that wanted to invest in this black cat ranch, which never actually existed, and he never actually intended to start. It was just mentioned in passing as a joke with some friends of his. But you see, somehow these jokes turn into major hoaxes, and these major hoaxes can turn into some good money-making opportunities. So let this be a lesson whenever you see a Bigfoot story. Take the time to look into it and see what the truth behind it is. And maybe after a period of time we can put an end to some of this reputation that we're developing ourselves into quite a little joke at the expense of the rest of society, as they talk about we Bigfoot loonies behind our backs. But that's enough for today. I've gone on for quite a while, and I'm going to start rambling here, so we'll cut you off today. And that's it for Bigfoot Tales, and hope you come back for another episode and subscribe to my videos. And until then, thanks for watching, and happy squatching.